Charlotte Wetton interviews Ella Frears on her new collection, Shine Darling, a digital residency for the poetry business. This is just like a really practical question, but I think it's just sometimes interesting to know like where you usually write.
Yeah, so where I'm sitting right now, which is my little desk in the little flat that we rent in Deptford, and we've lived here for me and my partner for like 6.5, maybe 7 years. And it's literally like it's part of the kitchen and living room. It's like the tiniest space, but for some reason it really works for me. I've got like loads of post-its up. I've got all my notes. And I, because I do lots of residencies and sort of collaborations when there's not a pandemic, I get offered sort of not regularly, but sort of semi-regularly, quite beautiful spaces to write. Or quite interesting spaces to write, and I find that I find it really freezes me up. I can't. It's like too much pressure. So I can write lots of notes, but I don't think I've ever finished a poem in somewhere beautiful. It has to be this like sort of cramped desk with like a really noisy car park outside. And that's where like I can get into the zone, which maybe is quite unusual, but it's like there's too much stuff going on in these beautiful places.
So you tend to just kind of do your notes there, like maybe have ideas there, but not write it up, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting, obviously the whole COVID thing has been trying and weird and awful for lots of people. But one sort of slightly interesting thing that's come out of it for me is that I've had time to reflect on how I work, because since I became self-employed in 2014, it's been a sort of constant hustle of jumping from residency to residency and doing like a million jobs at once. And I think that I thought that what I really wanted was to have a bit of time where I could just write whatever I wanted and sort of not have to be out in the world doing sort of public facing site specific stuff. And I think that actually having had that, although sort of albeit very sort of anxiety ridden as the time was, so I don't think it's like normal writing time, but still I just didn't write without the deadlines, without the stuff to respond to, when it was just me in my house, which is where I thought that I wanted to be writing. Nothing happened. And so I think that I need both. I need to be out in the world, I need to be in these interesting spaces having these conversations, and then to come back and sort of think about how I feel about all of that in a sort of neutral space. That I sort of one can't exist without the other, really.
I found the lack of kind of social contact and physical input of like being in different spaces really numbing in the pandemic. I felt really deadening and flattening. And I love spending time on my own. And normally I'm like, I want to spend more time on my own, but even I reach a peak level. Yeah.
But yeah, like I teach a lot, and I was telling my students, like, it'll be okay, you can write about anything can be a poem, like find stuff around your house, like be poet in residence of your bedroom, like be poet in residence of your body, and like all of this stuff. And I just couldn't take my own advice. I was so bored by everything around me. I couldn't write about it.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And you write a lot, like there's like 41 poems, I think, not including the central section of this book, which is like pretty fat for a first collection. And I know you published the middle section as a pamphlet before. So do you think that's deadline driven? Is that external pressure? Like how often do you manage to write?
Yeah, so that the book contains a lot of the poems that were written through these residencies. They might have changed shape since. I sort of didn't keep them in their original forms, lots of them, but the reason that there's quite a wide-ranging subject matter in the book is because of, I've had sort of a constant shift in subject every 6 or so months, where I've sort of had to jump from writing about a spacecraft to writing about a species of moss to writing about a bus route. So like all of these things start to sort of merge together and tie in. So there's a lot of work just purely because I was having to produce quite a lot, and like sort of without the central sequence, I think that it's probably not that many poems for a first collection, but the central sequence is quite sort of chunky. Fills a lot of space.
Yeah. And do you subscribe to the kind of write every day school of thought?
I think that would be great. I think if you can do that, that would be good. I work as a poet full time, and so sort of I could be writing every day, and I sort of am, I mean, there's obviously lots of like teaching of workshops and prepping for things, and lots of emailing involved. So it's not sort of purely like I'm just sitting at my desk, but I have, the way that my creative brain seems to work is that I think about what I need to write constantly, but write very little. So it's all sort of happening in my brain. So I might be watching sort of endless episodes of, I don't know, Love Island or Selling Sunset, and just feeling slightly like full of dread for a few weeks / months, and sort of thinking lots and lots and lots, but in a slightly sort of panicked way. And then depending on how much I have to write, like a week or a few days or a month before the deadline, suddenly my brain will kick in and I can write for like a full days at a time, like 10 hours. I'll just be writing and I'll forget to eat lunch. So it's like a lot of the work happens off the page, and I just have to kind of trust in that now, that it will kick in, because, you know, the closer and closer you get to a deadline, you suddenly think, but what if it doesn't? Like, what if it's not going to happen?
Yeah, it's quite a stressful process, isn't it? Yeah. So in that period where you're thinking about it a lot, do you write notes about it? Like, try not to write a poem, but try and write notes, or not put pen to paper?
Yeah, so it depends what I'm doing. Obviously, if it's a residency, then I'm quite often somewhere experiencing something for a bit. So like I had a residency in 2016 in the New Forest. So I was there for 8 weeks and had a studio and should have been making work. I was sort of just experiencing, and then a lot of stuff came after in the time when I was back, but there were kind of notes, bits of like photos, bits of recordings of sound. So I'll do sort of multimedia notes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I keep a journal, like really, really brief entries, but that kind of helps feed in. And then like lots of research, like if, like, for example, I did a residency for Tate St Ives. They commissioned some poems on the St Ives Modernist, and I spent some time in the archive, so I had lots of notes that sort of wasn't my language. It was Noam Garbo's or Barbara Hepworth's. So that will all feed in, and then I sort of sit with all of my notes around me, and do it that way.
I've never kept a journal. Is that sort of like practical entries, like what you have for breakfast, or is that sort of about you or about the work? Is what I mean.
It's kind of like slightly selfish in that I found that because I don't have like a diary on my phone or like a normal book diary that people carry around. I have a wall calendar that I have as like my sort of matrix of what's going on, and I found some old ones of those, and I found it really interesting to flick through and see all the different things I had been doing that I completely forgot about. So I decided that because I'm doing something different every day and for a different organisation usually most days, it's just nice to be able to keep track of what I was doing. But then obviously if I'm writing, then I'll write, oh, I had an idea for this thing, and what's nice about it is that I can now flick back once I finished a poem and see actually that I had the initial idea for that poem like 3 years ago or whatever, and I hadn't realised. So
wow, that's fascinating. So on to more poetry. So who's influenced you? Like, what poets do you think has really influenced your work? Like old favourites or more recent ones?
It's such a I always find this question difficult, mostly because there are so many, and it's
I know it's a mean question.
Such a mix of things. I can try. I guess that the fear is that you'll miss someone huge out, but I don't think the poetry police aren't going to come for me. I think it's going to be fine. So one of the books that first influenced me poetically, weirdly, isn't a book of poetry. It's Toni Morrison's Beloved. Okay. And there's a poetic sequence in there, or a sequence that's written in a slightly sort of lyric modernist way in somebody's voice, like a sort of monologue, and that I found that really affecting. And I thought, okay, wow, you can commit to an idea and just write straight into it, which I think is something that's kind of specific to poetry, or happens more in poetry than it does in prose, where you don't have to sort of explain anything. There's not a sort of setting the scene or a narrative. You can just go straight into someone's voice and sort of jump through time. And so that I found really affecting. And then another one was Anne Carson's The Beauty of the Husband, just because the way that she holds a sort of narrative thread across sort of separate sections, and also sort of is interacting with like poetic history with Keats and his marginalia. Yeah, I think that probably had the biggest effect on the middle sequence of my book.
And who are you reading at the moment? Have you any recommendations of who we should know about?
Again, I think
You're going to tell me you're just watching Love Island, right?
Yeah, only. I've set aside all my time. I'll no longer be reading. No, I think that what have I read recently? Boyega Odebanjo's Auntie and Uncle Poems, which is from Poetry Business. That's an amazing pamphlet. I love pamphlets. I think pamphlets are a great way to sort of be introduced to poets. So Emily Cooper's pamphlet from Machina Books, or Machina, I don't know how you pronounce their press, but they're a great press. Rough Trade have got a brilliant series of 4 pamphlets called Four Brown Girls Who Write, which is brilliant. Who else? Oh, Obsidian. The Obsidian Foundation are doing amazing things with poets. There's some really brilliant poets that you should read if you look them up. Prototype, Caleb Place's book coming out from Prototype is really amazing. So yeah, I think that these small experimental presses are doing really good things at the moment.
Yeah, that's where the excitement's at, isn't it? I've just ordered a bunch of pamphlets from Bad Betty Press, and yeah, Amy, I'm really excited to read Amy Akers.
Yeah, Bad Betty, Broken Sleep, all of those smaller presses that are doing really exciting things, I think, would be where I would start if I were looking for a contemporary poet to read.
So turning to Shinedown and then some more getting into the book, I've got loads of questions about it. I've attempted to kind of formulate them into questions, and it's really hard asking someone about their work because you're like, they've given you a poem, what more do you want? So I'll do my best. One of the things I liked about the book and sort of noticed about the book was that kind of ear for language and that kind of eye for a social situation. So I'm thinking of poems like ETA and You a Teenager, which just feel like so well observed, and that the language is just kind of pitch perfect. Like I just really feel like I'm there in that situation. So I was wondering, is this kind of a writing processy question really? I was wondering how you listen. Do you have any techniques or kind of practices that help you to listen when you're kind of out and about? How do you pick up on these nuances of language? How do you keep listening?
That's so interesting. I'm now thinking like I would love to hear everybody else's answer on that question, because it's such an interesting question. I'm not sure I know how I know that there are things that I find amusing. I think that everyone has their own things, that bits of language they find amusing. And I think that when I started writing poetry, because I felt and still feel like I didn't have a huge grasp of a wide vocabulary, because at the school that I went to, it was sort of uncalled to know more than a few words or to speak in a different way. I think, which is fine. But I think that I felt embarrassed about using words that I didn't feel like I had access to. So it was kind of important to me that I wrote exactly kind of how I spoke. Or like if I was sort of talking to my friends or at a dinner party or to my partner, that kind of register. But that I would apply that to writing about anything. And so whether it was sort of art, modernism, I don't know, motorway service stations is the other one, ATA you mentioned. And so I think that once I had that sort of structure, then you can go back in when you're editing and sort of amplify things so I can think back to, the You a Teenager, the poem that you're talking about, is about an argument that I had with my English teacher at school about Tracy Emin's bed not being art, as in he was saying that it wasn't art and I was saying that it was, and about the sort of frustration of not having the linguistic skills to argue at that point with an adult, even though I sort of felt very strongly that I was right, or that I had a right to that opinion at least. And so
that comes across so strongly in the poem. Like I'm with you, yeah. I'm in that classroom with you boys messing your hair, and yeah.
So I think that then when I'm editing, you can go back in, and I found that like the more that I sort of exaggerate or amplify the language of that space, the more true it feels, or the more close to that, even if it sort of is taken away from how I exactly remember it, it feels truer in atmosphere than it would have had I tried to sort of mirror directly exactly what was said or where I was or sort of what was happening. So I don't know. And then things like ETA, I think I don't think it's like a thing specific to me, but I really am fascinated by those moments in my life when I'm not quite sure who was in the right, where I might have behaved badly, but it's not fully clear, and it doesn't feel straightforward to me. And so that kind of like family conflict where you might have a strong opinion and you might feel that you were right, but deep down you kind of know that that's not, it's not a sort of linear black and white thing, that there are complexities to that. And I think that I like to, again, I like to sort of amplify the speaker's flaws, because it sort of becomes a sort of more accurate representation of how that feels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Something I really noticed in the book, especially for first collection, is like how strong the voice is and like how consistent throughout the collection. And I just wondered if this was something you were conscious of or had worked on or felt to be important, or not at all. Like, it's, you know, some people don't.
Yeah, I think that it's something that develops, and I think that kind of accidentally, but luckily, this, like I said, this sort of various residencies and jobs, sort of having to write through the prism of various different contexts, meant that my voice was sort of, I was able to look at my poetic voice from different sort of angles and different aspects and through different forms. And I think that in that way, it made it sort of fuller, because I wasn't just writing in one style and about one, like just about memories. I had to do like my personal memories through conservation or through travel or whatever it was that I had to think about. And I think that helps give the poem texture, and give the voice sort of depth, in a way that I sort of didn't intend, but I think that might be what's going on.
Yeah, and it's a very engaging voice, and it's quite, I suppose, vernacular, which from what you've said earlier, that makes sense, that style. And I think that wrong-footed me at first, I think, when I read the book, because so I wanted to ask you about form and some sort of technicalities around kind of line length and sentence, and how you negotiate the sentence and the poetic line. So the first time I read the book, I felt it was written very fluidly, like it was quite loose structure, a lot of loose forms on the page, like coming into your own, the overwhelming urge. I think especially because some of the earlier poems, you know, there's a lot of different line lengths, The Little Death of the Author. That was one where I was like puzzling over your line lengths. I was like, why has she broken the line there? I don't understand. And then when I went back to the book a second time, I was like, this really formal forms. Like I just missed them the first time because I was just carried away by this quite vernacular voice. And I just got really, sucked into the kind of persona that these poems are written in. It's so engaging and so likable. And so I had to sort of work a bit to then unpack the forms. And I was like, she doesn't use meter. And then I went back and I was like, I'll ask her about meter. And then I was like, oh my God, they're all meter. I just sort of missed it because it feels so natural and fluid. So just wondered if you could talk a bit about form, where it comes in the writing process, and how you sort of negotiate the breath, the line, the sentence. I think you do that really interestingly.
Yeah, thank you. It's really important to me in terms of it sort of working as a tool, again, to sort of get outside of myself or sort of push my writing voice around a corner, or push it into a corner. So I did a course with Mimi Calvati at the Poetry School quite early on, called Versification, where you try out not all of the different forms, but lots of different forms. And I found that really formative, because it sort of allowed, I kind of knew what they were. And then the thing that she explained would happen is that when you've written a draft, the form can sort of show itself, or the form that it wants to be in, like it will pull itself into tercets, or it will suggest that it has enough repetition that it could be a sestina, or, you know, that it doubles back on itself like a pantoum. So like, I think that I then started listening to my drafts and thinking about where they might like to go. And for me, every poem in that book has been reworked a lot. They've all been through so many stages of editing, and I really enjoy the process of taking a draft and sort of putting it into, say, meter, and then taking it out again and seeing what has happened to it. So quite a lot of, I guess, if you're picking up on, I mean, so like the little tiny moss poem is metered, I guess it's in stress meter, but a lot of them will feel like they have a rhythm, but they might have been sort of eased out of it slightly, so they it's harder to pin down, I guess.
I felt like there was quite a lot of like loose iambic going on. That felt really natural, and then you're like, oh no, it couldn't be written in any other order. I can't reorder those words, which is You can tell it's been crafted at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's like funny things like, so I have a poem called Fucking in Cornwall, which
I love that one.
Thank you. But that I was originally written for a night that Inuit Ellams and Teresa Lola run, which is called Rap Party, and you have to respond to a rap song and a hip hop song. It was originally written in the rhythm of 50 Cent's Just a Little Bit, and even though it's sort of way out of that now, it started there, and it's sort of been through lots of different shapes to get where it was. But I think that there's something slightly catchy about it, and that it's come from the fact that it sort of was in the form of a song to begin with. So I think that even though it's kind of invisible labour in that, you know, a lot, even the sestinas in there are sort of, and I mean, they're not metered sestinas anymore, and they're kind of harder to spot and slightly sort of fragmented. I think that it's not wasted work, because form like leaves a mark and allows you to sort of write lines that you never would otherwise. So I think that I owe quite a lot, if there are any, I'm not saying that there are, but if there are any sort of more innovative sort of feeling poems, I think it owes a lot to sort of traditional form at some point.
And what about the prose poems? Because there's quite a few of those. Do they kind of emerge in sort of in the same way, like it's kind of in a later draft, or do you feel differently about them?
I never know how I love prose poems. I find it really hard when students ask me about them, because so I quite often read a piece of flash fiction in a magazine and I think that it's a prose poem. So I obviously don't really understand the boundaries between those two things, but
they're just pretending that they do.
I think so. Just for some of them, that's the form that they felt like they needed to be in. I think that occasionally, for me, line breaks can feel a bit forced, or like they're sort of pulling too much, or like that just having a sort of paragraph. There's that brilliant James Tate quote about prose poems that I think Caroline Bird tweeted the other day, where he talks about a paragraph as being very unthreatening, and that people come across it and they think, oh, this is not going to be sort of pretentious or poetic, I'm safe here, and then by the time you get to the end of the little paragraph you're like, whoa, okay, that was a poem. I think that there's something kind of like sweet and unthreatening about a little box of text that you can use sort of effectively, and I like to think that just like every poem in the book is sort of, it's arrived at the form that it wanted to be in, I hope.
And you have some killer lines. Like I was kind of intrigued by you use sentences so effectively. So my favourite one is, I asked him to check the roof and took the ladder away, the poem is called. And this is my favourite sentence in the whole book: the dinner party was wonderful. So simple. It's just like snuck in there on like the fourth stanza, and it's like, yeah, it tells the whole story almost in that one. And do you think about breath with the line? And you've got quite a lot of long lines as well, I noticed. Does that tie into that unthreatening thing you were talking about, that you don't want to force a break? Is that?
Yeah, sometimes I kind of want the line to be taken whole. I think when I was at Goldsmiths, doing my BA, I read a lot of C.K. Williams, who has really long lines. And I think that must have gone in, because I enjoy a longer line. But I don't know, equally I think it's just about how much time you want someone to spend with that line, and how quickly you want and breathlessly you want to pull them down, because there are really skinny poems in there as well that I wanted to sort of and so I think it was just, it will have, if it's in long lines, it will have been in short lines as well at some point. Like they've all been in all the shapes. So I think that I don't know which poem you're looking at, but I imagine that I landed on it for some particular reason.
And was the publisher okay with you turning the page around for the ones that are shifted?
Yeah, I mean, Martha, who's my publisher from Oxford Road Books, she did that. I wasn't aware that was gonna, I mean, I knew once I'd seen the proofs, but yeah, I think that for the ones that are sideways, they were ones that I just couldn't re-break, or like, so Phases of the Moon, Things I've Done is one that's side, and I need that gap between the Phases of the Moon and you couldn't get that on a page normally. So I think it's like quite fun to have them on their side. I liked it. It was a nice surprise on this one page. I mean, every page was a surprise. That
Like, I love the variety of form in it. It's so dull, isn't it, when you pick up a book and you're halfway through and you're like, oh, every poem is going to look like this. It's sort of like a little bit of my enthusiasm sort of dies when I realise that they're just going to do the same form the whole way through. So yeah, I really loved it. The other thing that really struck me when I first started reading it, and like still does, is the apparent, it is an art form, so I'm going to say apparent intimacy and honesty of the book. It's kind of unflinching, and I think partly around physicality, like female desire, the female body, but also around that, it felt to me like a really recurring theme was that boundary we draw between ourselves and other people, kind of psychologically and emotionally. And I really felt like that in this book, that boundary was really slippery and was being redrawn all the time and questioned like all the time. And when I started reading it, it's a bit cringy question, but I want to ask you about like as a young woman publishing, like how you sort of decide what to put out there and why, because I don't really think very much about like, oh, women writers, you know, in our contemporary era that much, because it feels quite old hat. But then when I started reading this book, I was like, actually, I think there is a lot of self-censorship going on in contemporary poetry, and I've just not really been attuned to it, because this felt like so unflinching and like really felt like just putting it out there. So yeah, I just wondering if you have any thoughts about doing that either through persona or voice or.
I think that's a really lovely observation. As a person in my sort of general life, I'm sort of, I'll share most things, I guess an oversharer, and also have just never really had a problem with talking about some stuff that some people find more difficult to talk about, and so I think that I didn't have to sort of I didn't have to reach for any of the things that are in there. There's sort of stuff that I would not, I mean, maybe not everything actually, like the stuff that's sort of towards sexual trauma, I might not like bring that up at a dinner party every time, but things about sort of sex and desire, I probably would chat about that with most people. But I think that I hadn't realised that it was in any way radical until I started sort of publishing work and reading work aloud, and the reactions from people were interesting and not always positive. And I think that I thought, oh, okay, so this is my everyday, you know, sort of sex and periods and masturbations and pissing and whatever. They're like bodily things, and lots of people experience them. And I'm not sort of, there's nothing super explicit in there. It's not like I'm sort of, when I'm writing about sex, I'm not writing about the sex act necessarily. It's more sort of the stuff around desire. And in like sort of a lyric way anyway. So I never thought that I was writing like erotica or anything, but that occasionally there would be people who would react sort of strongly to it. And I think that if anything, that made me sort of more determined to put it in. And I'm never sort of aiming to shock anyone. I hope that it sort of feels like sort of cheeky and intimate rather than like I'm trying to like batter anybody with. And
we should say some of it is really funny, so everybody has to see. I love that poem. It's just like, and there are some dark moments in the book, but there's a lot of really light moments as well. It's a great bit. Yeah And
it's stuff that I find funny, like I think that you know, weeing on a hill while a low flying helicopter comes over, like that's a funny memory for me, and so like why not put it in the book or whatever it is. And I think that I'm glad you find it funny. I find it funny. It's not, I'm only trying to connect through my poetry. I'm never trying to sort of alienate anybody. So no,
there's loads of really light moments. I think I like that animal one as well. One about the cat licking the wall. What's the title?
Definitely the way Captivity is Justified.
Yeah, that's it. Which is again can be read as a really dark poem or as a really funny poem, I think.
That was the last poem that I finished for the book, and I sent it. I mean, I had a draft of it already in the thing, but I decided to change it late, and it was like really close to going to print. And I sent the new draft over to Martha, the editor, and she, I thought like she's going to say no or whatever, and she just sent me an email just saying, "You've spelled llama wrong. I've corrected it." It's like, okay, cool, it's in. But yeah,
possibly an editor at the end of her tether.
But that's Yeah, I think that's like me exercising my guilt of we won a goldfish at a fair, me and my partner, kind of by accident, and then suddenly realized that we had to look after this goldfish and try and give it as good a life as it could have, and the sort of how depressed it got in the tank, no matter what we did. I felt so guilty, so I thought I should write it in to a poem. So yeah, that's where that one came from.
But again, it picks up on this theme of like responsibility and boundaries and like what we're prepared to do. Yeah, that's a lot of poems. So that process of putting the collection together, you mentioned you had like a last minute adjustment. How did you sort of go about that? Was it a question of collating, or did you have to sort of write towards a point that you wanted to get to? Or
yeah, I think that I would have sort of continued writing the collection forever. Like I didn't have any sort of idea of it being a book. And then I had a sort of like tutorial with Joe Shapcott, who has been like an amazing presence for me in terms of like a sort of influential, sort of poetry mentor. And she looked at the structure of my book, and she did this like amazing thing where it was like she could, so we had the printed out manuscript there, and it was like a rough thing that I just sort of put together for my MA, I think. And she just quickly started like reordering and putting things into sections and putting poems together, and I'd never seen anyone do that before. And even though it's sort of not in that same structure anymore because lots of poems were written after that point and things were added, it sort of it was like getting a crash course in how you sort of make associations and where you can put things and how things can hang together in sections without it being sectioned as a collection. So that was amazing. And then like the classic sort of laying it out on the floor all printed out, did lots of that. And the sequence in the middle really helped to sort of to create sort of space between one half the other half. And so those two spaces were interesting to sort of play with the order. So yeah, it happened over like a few years, but I think.
How do you think about the first and last section? Do you think about those differently?
Yeah, I think that sort of roughly, because the book is sort of basically about that period between girlhood and womanhood, or like that transition, and it's definitely a book that, you know, I'm coming to the end of my 20s now this year, and I think that it was very much a book about sort of teenagehood to early 20s, and that now if I tried to write that book I probably couldn't, because I'm a different person and the concerns are different, so it feels very strongly sort of concerned with the things that we are told to be concerned with, or that are pressed upon us, or that we're trying to figure out. And so the first half for me is sort of about the confusion of desire and sort of figuring things out, and sort of youth and adolescence, and then the middle sequence sort of circles around a near abduction thing that happened to me when I was 10, and there were like various things that sort of narratives through that about sort of sexual threat and desire and how we navigate those two things together. And then the last half is more sort of like, there are more sort of politically driven poems, there are poems about art, so it's like sort of slightly less concerned with sort of growing up, and I hope that there's like a feeling of like regaining agency at the end, that there's that with the poem that you mentioned before, with the sort of trapping the boyfriend on the roof, that there's sort of like a power shift. So yeah, that's how I see the sections, but I am also like happy for anyone to read them how they like to read them, and I know that people don't read books from cover to cover either.
Yeah, I always do read a poetry collection from cover to cover, but yeah, I know many people don't. Yeah, I know, because I know how much work goes into ordering it. So I don't want to mess up the poet's work. I mean, yeah, I found putting my first pamphlet together really difficult, and I'm putting together a second pamphlet now, and it's like my brain is not big enough to contain all of these of possibilities. It's like playing chess with yourselves. It's like there's just too many consequences that follow on one from another to keep in your head. Do you have any advice for anyone putting together a collection? Did anyone give you some useful advice?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I guess my advice would be that your book is yours, and that it doesn't have to sort of follow any previous structures that have been put in place by other people, that you can read around and see what you like that other collections are doing, but what works for their poems won't necessarily work for yours, so you have to sort of I think that you have to sort of try it in different orders in order to know which order that you want. I think maybe you're someone that has a really strong idea of how you want it to look, and that's fine, and it goes straight into that. But I think I like to be sure about the form, and so even if I feel like I found the form that it's going to be in, I will take it out of that and riff it apart and then put it back together just in case. I know that's a slightly abstract answer to the question.
Yeah,
and making sure that every poem like is in there because you want it to be in there, not because you feel like you need the number of poems. I guess it sounds like an obvious thing, but I was like joyfully removing poems like quite like a lot through the process. You know, I was really happy as soon as I felt liberated to like remove something, because it felt like it was good. It was like a move in the right direction because things were sort of condensing, and it was for me getting stronger as a book.
And did you write anything for the like? Did you think, oh, there's a bit of a hole here, I need to write a poem about X?
I don't know. That's that's again something that I would say happens like if I were teaching, but I don't know that because just of the nature of the way that I work. After the book was with, like, once the book was with Offord Road Books, I had a residency where I was writing about motorway service stations. So there were like lots of poems that came from that I put in after the fact, and I wonder whether because I was writing that, knowing the shape of my collection, I was writing about motorway services in a way that I knew would fit in. But again, it's never purely just like writing, it's always writing with like a dual purpose or with a particular theme in mind, which I know sounds like in the poetry world it's slightly unusual, and I think that lots of people hear that and they think that I must have compromised the work in some way, like because there's a sort of commission is a slightly dirty word still for some people, but actually for me it helps to generate work, and that I think my best work comes from when I'm sort of deep in research about something that I've been forced to research, even if it's been forced by myself, because the motorway services thing was a project that I wrote. But yeah, that's just how I get my best poems.
Kind of going back to that, deciding that intimacy and honesty and deciding what to put out, then do you feel very free in what you produce? Do you feel like there are constraints on what you write in any way?
I think, I do feel free, but I think that we have responsibilities as a writer, and there are things that I wouldn't write, and I am very careful with the editing to make sure that any sort of ambiguities are there on purpose, and that there's no sort of that it's not harmful to anyone in any way, or that the language I'm using isn't like sloppy in a way that would be unkind for people. And you know, when writing about, I think that people should write their traumas how they want to write them, and if they want to write them in an incredibly sort of visceral and raw way, that's fine. I think that I would never, I've heard it described as sort of milking the trauma. I would never really like lean on my own trauma in order to sort of affect a reader in a certain way, because I think that you can't know what your reader's been through. I think you can only come from your own experience and how you want to write that experience. And so I think that I can always tell in a draft if I've been pushing too hard, if I've been trying for a certain effect. And I think that I would, in some stage of the editing, would remove that and sort of try for honesty or for openness, rather than anger. Or if it's anger, then anger in an open and honest way, not in a way that's sort of lashing out at the reader.
Yeah. I was wondering if we could finish with you reading a poem. I totally sprung this on you. It just occurred to me that you're here and I've got your voice, and it'd be really nice to hear something.
Yeah, of course. Is there one you would like? Maybe You a Teenager?
Or maybe Captivity is Justified.
Okay, yeah. Cool. Yeah, Captivity is Justified, yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Captivity is justified. When I look into her tank, she turns away from me, says the scientist on the TV. She's coy. Lab coat, shiny face, pipette trembling above a spider. Oh, that golden summer. A brace of ducks at my heels wherever I went. Eels 50 years old snaking through the river towards our nets. I'd say Augustus the llama was more of a childhood acquaintance than a pet. Basil the chestnut bull, an idol. A seal once tugged the zip of my wetsuit down. While playing hide and seek as a child, I interrupted my friend's old ginger cat who had been licking a wall. The room was unlit and shadowy. The cat, George, had long limbs. I was the only human around. George turned from the spot he'd been licking and yowled, "Die!" Chicken in my oven buttered, goldfish in my fish tank bored. All I want's a puppy, a little puppy to adore.
Bravo! That was wonderful. That was so nice to hear.
I don't know that I've ever read that one out loud.
There's also, going back to my point about sentences, there is another few killer sentences. So, "What I want's a puppy, a little puppy to adore." It's not written in a totally smooth way. And so you sort of remember the cadence and the rhythm of that line. It was going around my head the other day, actually. And lockdown has made us all want a little puppy to adore. And us have given into that, and some of us haven't. And also, "I was the only human around." I love that really short sentence because it just flips the poem. It's like your sort of world perspective that actually humans are not the centre of this.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I had a friend called Freddie Poznansky at school, who weirdly I recently reconnected with, and most of the animals in this poem were hers. Her
Right.
at least. And I was explaining that that George was in there yowling "die." And she was like, "He did used to do that."
That's what he said.
So yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, Ella. Thank you so much for answering all my really vague, garbled questions and that reading. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.